and it apparently improves connectivity. So rest assured that you're not the only one tuning in, and y'all are mic'd for the remainder of the webinar, but you can use the chat box. So today we have Leone and Patrick Pennarola, both graduate students at the University of Minnesota, to talk to us about their project involving the effects of fire versus grazing management on remnant tallgrass prairie bees and butterflies. So I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say. You can take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Jessica. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And thank you again to Jessica for pulling us all together and for the introduction. So as she just said, my name is Patrick Pennarola, and I'm a grad student in the Department of Entomology at the University of Minnesota.
And I'm Julia Leone, a graduate student in the Conservation Biology graduate program at the University of Minnesota.
So maybe as evident by our co-presenting, this project is a highly collaborative effort. In addition to the two of us, we also work closely with Jen Larson at the University of Minnesota, Karen Oberhauser, formerly of the University of Minnesota, now at UW-Madison, and Diane Larson of the USGS. And as it says right there, we're investigating the effects of fire and grazing management on on prairie remnants, on pollinators, excuse me, specifically the bees and butterflies. So, there we go. I'm sure you've all seen this map a million times, so we're not going to talk about it today. You are all well aware of the history of prairie in Minnesota and the challenges it faces. Similarly, you know that we mimic historic natural disturbance with contemporary management techniques. There are still, however, some gaps in our knowledge. While the effects of fire on prairie communities have been well documented and well tested, conservation grazing has not seen the same level of study. Now, Sarah Vosick spoke recently in this webinar series on the grassland monitoring team's work, and we know Fred Harris spoke about patchburn grazing. But for Minnesota, there's little in the scientific literature on grazing's impacts on prairies. Now, I would like to point out that for the sake of our project, we are treating burning and grazing as two separate practices. We know that historically they would have co-occurred, and we know that there's some exciting patchburn grazing work underway here in Minnesota. But for our purposes, we are trying to suss out the differing effects of these two practices in isolation. Of course, prairie plants are already known to vary with management techniques. Certain species thrive in burned prairies, while others are more prevalent in grazed prairies. Anyone who's attended a native plant training workshop has gotten a list of burning and grazing increasers and decreasers. Changes to plant communities can be expected to have impacts on the organisms that rely upon those plants. So butterflies and bees rely upon plants for food during their entire life cycles. Caterpillars feed on leaves before metamorphosing into nectar-feeding adults. Bees feed on pollen and nectar as both larvae and adults. Many butterflies and bees rely upon plants for their homes as well, with their chrysalids tucked at the base of plants and with some bees holed up in hollow stems. You can see there that's a xylocopa nest, not from Minnesota. That's actually in an agave stem, I believe, from Arizona. It's a really big bee. It's pretty cool. So the effects of grazing and fire on pollinators are less studied than the effects on plant communities, and the results from the few studies that have been done are less conclusive. This is where our research comes into play. We are seeking to address that gap and document the relative effects of fire and conservation grazing on Minnesota's prairie plant and associated pollinator communities. Because management can take years to become apparent, we are using existing remnant prairies with known management histories from the past 10 years. Site selection was based on this criteria, as well as prairie type, and whether or not we could get permission from folks to work there. And we are very thankful for the folks who did agree to work with us. So looking at a distribution of our sites, so you might notice most of our sites are found in that purple box, which represents the Morris Wetland Management District. So we selected 75 sites for vegetation surveys, and we're using a subset of 20 of those for insects. Now, there will be more details on our vegetation surveys and the results we find there in our spring webinar and workshops. We do have some information on that at the end of our presentation, so we'll keep you informed on when that's coming out. So just to kind of orient you to this map, the filled in symbols are insect sites. The triangles represent burned prairies, the circles represent grazed prairies, and we have a range from up north, Ulen WMA, which is in Clay County, down south to Hole in the Mountain, which is a TNC property in Lake Benton in Lincoln County. So as I mentioned, we worked with a variety of folks. I would like to say we worked with Fish and Wildlife on this. We had some Fish and Wildlife properties. We worked with the DNR. We worked on TNC sites and a handful of private landowners who were graceful enough to, or were kind enough to work with us.
Great, so moving on to the butterflies, one of the basic questions driving this study is whether or not fire and grazing management differ in their effects on the overall species richness and abundance of butterflies. So here I expect to see species-specific responses to management, and as Patrick mentioned earlier, butterfly species rely on many different plants for food, both as larvae and as adults, and for overwintering. So if fire and grazing differ in their effects on these plants, that is likely to impact the abundance and richness of the species that rely on them. In addition to this, there are many butterfly life history traits such as mobility, how a species overwinters, when it flies, and those are all likely to tie into the management responses as well. So one thing that I'm interested in is looking to see if fire may have a more direct negative effect on butterfly species that overwinter as eggs or chrysalids than it does on those that overwinter in a more mobile state as adults or larvae. This seems especially likely if a site has little refugia in the surrounding landscape for butterflies to recolonize from, so a more isolated site. And similarly, butterfly species that overwinter at the bases of grasses, I'm thinking they might be less disturbed by grazing than they are by fire because cattle tend not to graze all the way down to the base of plants, whereas fire may completely eradicate, I guess, or just the top of those plants. So at each site, at each of our sites, we visited, again, 3 times a summer for 2 summers during summers of 2016 and 2017. During each site visit, butterflies were sampled using 2 methods. The first method we used was a modification of the pollard walk, which is a quantitative approach that has been used widely to assess butterfly relative abundance. At each site, we set up 400 meters of transects prior to sampling. We surveyed all prairie types, wet, mesic, and dry, in proportion to their area at a given site. And Patrick's going to talk more about that in the bee description, so when he goes into that, that also applies to butterfly sampling. For the pollard walk, the observer walks each transect at a steady pace. In our case, that's approximately 10 meters per minute. And that observer then records each species seen within a 5-meter square box to the front of them. And this consistent distance from the observer provides a standardized measure of species relative abundance without having to calculate species-specific distance detectability, which would be quite different at a long distance for a very mobile species that's large, say a monarch, than it would be for a very small skipper butterfly. The second survey method we used was an opportunistic walk. And the purpose of this additional survey was to compile a more complete species list for each site, including the presence of rare species that might otherwise have been missed during the pollard walk. The opportunistic walk was conducted once per site visit and took between 30 and 120 minutes, depending on site area and conditions. For both survey methods, butterflies were identified primarily by site or were captured, identified, and released. Voucher specimens were collected and will be deposited in the University of Minnesota insect collection if you ever want to come check them out. Our analyses are still ongoing. However, preliminary results from both survey methods described earlier show that 38 butterfly species were observed over both years, 30 of which were shared across management types. So these were seen at both burned and grazed sites. Of the butterfly species that were management specific, 4 of these were seen only at grazed sites. 2 of these, which are highlighted in black in that bold box, are known to be more closely associated with prairie habitats. And these are the prairie ringlet and the tawny-edged skipper, both of which feed on grasses during their larval stage. 4 butterfly species were also seen exclusively at sites managed with fire. Of these, again highlighted in black, the Orogo skipper, which also feeds on prairie grasses, is considered to be prairie dependent as well. It's worth noting, well, actually, I jumped ahead a little here. It's worth noting that two of these management-specific butterflies, the tawny-edged and the checkered skipper, had only two of them had more than 5 observations each, and therefore represent either rare or difficult to detect species. Just wanted to point that out. The relative abundance data from the pollard transect shows that butterfly species varied greatly in their frequency of occurrence. In this graph, for example, butterfly species on the x-axis and number of individuals on the y-axis, and prairie-associated species are starred in blue. You can see that 5 of the 6 most abundant species were more abundant at burn sites, and those are circled in red there. On the other hand, several of the rarer species appeared to be more abundant at grazed sites, although again, these are in very low abundances. So I'm looking forward to teasing out these differences a little bit more to see if there are particular traits or landscape conditions interacting with management to drive these patterns we're seeing here. Insect populations can vary a lot within and between years, which is one reason we are pooling multiple years of data for this study. For example, the variation between years, an example of that is the difference in abundance between painted ladies in 2016 versus 2017. I'm sure many of you noticed the unusual large migration of painted ladies across Minnesota this summer, and this shows up in our data pretty strongly. You can see that was our most abundant butterfly in 2017, but pretty far down on the list in 2016. However, regal fritillaries with the purple arrow now, which are a prairie-dependent species, had very consistent abundance and distribution between years. And a few other prairie-dependent species, which are starred here, were only observed during 1 year of this study, either in 2016 or 2017, and at very low abundances.
All right, on to the questions driving our bee research. So the first and second questions listed here are very similar to the first 2 questions Julia had up there. I really want to know if grazed and burned prairies differ in regards to bee diversity. Simply that. So I predict that species richness and community composition will vary between management techniques. As we mentioned earlier, plant communities are known to change with the form of disturbance. I believe that bees, reliant upon those plants for food and in some cases shelter, as I mentioned, will track these changes as well. However, not all the impacts from management may be due to vegetation, which brings us to my third question regarding nesting habits. So some bees nest in cavities underground, while other bees nest above ground, such as those stem nesters. Studies have shown that some ground nesting bees can tolerate grassland burns so long as their nests are deep enough underground. Really just a few inches below the soil, temperatures remain fairly constant during the duration of most burns, and survivability is pretty high. Studies have also shown that insects living within plant tissues during prairie burns suffer high mortality. That wasn't done with bees, that was done with gall-forming wasps, but I think it could be informative. Therefore, I suspect that in burn prairies, ground nesters will fare better than stem nesters and will thus make up a greater proportion of species present. At grazed sites, without the pressures of fire, I believe that stem nesters will fare better. I also could see cattle negatively impacting some ground nesters. By compacting the soil, they may make it more difficult for smaller bodied bees to excavate nests, so I'll be looking into that. So bee sampling occurred simultaneously with butterfly sampling. We were at the same sites on the same days. Similarly to what Julia described, my collection of bees took place in 2 ways, using 2 methods. The first method was using bee bowls. So there's a photo of a full bee bowl right there on the right side. So this is a passive trap for bees that provides us with abundance data for each of our site visits. So the basic idea of bee bowls, I'm sure some of you may have used them before, but the basic idea is that you set up 30 colored bowls. We use a mixture of white, yellow, and blue bowls. You set them up along a transect and then fill the bowls with soapy water. You leave that in place for 24 hours and then come back to collect your samples. Bees and a lot of other insects, as we find in our bowl traps, when they're flying through the site, they'll spot this bowl, think it's a big old flower full of good stuff, good pollen and nectar, and they swoop in to get a closer view. So the soap in the water has broken the surface tension, so the bees fall to the bottom where they drown and stay in place, so we can come get them the next day. Now, to try and survey our sites thoroughly, we divvied up bowls among prairie types. So looking at that little graphic I made on the bottom left. For example, if our site was 50% wet prairie, 15 of our bowls went in on wet transects. And if the 40% was mesic and 10% dry, then there would be 12 bowls and 3 bowls in each of those respective areas, just to try and sample the prairie types evenly. The second method involved a meandering walk, again, very similar to Julia's, and I will be using this primarily to add to species lists. To control for detectability, because similar to butterflies, some bees are much larger. On the right, you can see a bumblebee who had found his way to my sleeve, or her way, not sure, probably her. Some of those are much easier to see when they're flying through the prairie than a tiny little metallic sweat bee. So I only sampled bees on flowers to try and account for some of that detectability. So that bee on my shirt would have been a no-go. Now, unlike Julia, I was not identifying my specimens in the field. To identify bees, you really need to use a stereo microscope. I have not yet worked my way through the thousands of bee specimens we collected over the course of 2 years. The majority of those came from bee bowls. Some sites, some days, for a 24-hour period, we collected well over 1,000 bees just in one sample. However, I am excited to be able to share with you today some early findings from a subset of bees. I've identified all of the bees collected on the meandering walks to the generic level, to genus, and I've explored what trends we see in generic richness. It will be interesting to see how the full set of bees reflect this subset, as well as how trends change once we're looking at species level diversity below the generic level. Oh, and that book on the bottom left is great, Guide to the Bees of North America. I highly recommend it. So I've identified 22 bee genera listed here from a sample of about 600 bees. That's our meandering walk bees. Here you can see that most genera were found in both burned and grazed prairies, though a number were only seen in one management type, and I have those listed on the right. Now, I think it's always worth it to take a look at some of these photos of bees, to look at some photos of the bees we're talking about. Everybody's familiar with honeybees and bumblebees, but they really are only a fraction of the variety of bees we see here in Minnesota. So on the top left, we have Agapostemon, bright green metallic bee. Below that, there's the long antennaed Melisodes bees. Over to the right, there's the yellow masked Hylaeus, really cool bees. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then this kind of pearly banded Nomia bee. Yeah, I just wanted to show you guys that there's quite the array of native bees here in Minnesota, and it's been really enjoyable to get to look at them in the field and in detail under the scope. Our sites varied in the number of genera seen. So here we have sites listed across the bottom of the graph, and the green bars represent grazed prairies, the black bars represent burned prairies. So our site with the greatest generic richness is Wolf. You can see it on the left, and it was a private site, or one of our private gray sites. It borders Glacial Lake State Park, so I think that actually might have something to do with the extreme amount of diversity we see there. It's a beautiful site in and of itself, though, with rolling hills and some patches of dry prairie. It's a really neat place out there. Now, at this point, there are some light trends in generic diversity, I would say. 6 of our 7 most generic rich sites are burned, but with such small numbers of genera, really no site had more than 10 genera present. I don't think there's much indication of a difference at this time. Once we have more data, we can see what that shows. There are some clear differences, however, in distribution when we compare across genera. So again, we have genera listed along the bottom. The genus Bombus, which is bumblebees, was the most widely distributed, occurring in all but one of our sites. Then following that are the genera Apis and Melisodes, that's honeybees and longhorned bees. They're a close second. And then 2 genera of metallic sweat bees, Oglochlorella and Lasioglossum, also have very wide distributions. And I just pulled those 2 out just to mention, I think, having looked through a lot of our bowl data already, not all of it, of course, I think those 2 genera will be are most abundant. They occur in almost all of our samples at really high numbers. So I'm sure those two names you'll be hearing a lot from our subsequent talks. And then it is worth pointing out that a number of our genera were only seen at 1 or 2 sites. Next, we're going to look at a breakdown of each genus between burned and grazed sites. And there are a couple of interesting points here. Now, most genera were seen at both treatments, as you saw in that first chart. But here you can see that that was at relatively equivalent frequencies. There are those 8 genera that were only seen in burned or grazed sites. Those make up some of the least frequently seen genera. But with the genus Hylaeus, kind of near the middle of the pack, it's that tall black bar without any green next to it, serving as a bit of an outlier. And that's, again, it was seen at 6 sites, but only burned. Now, the next few slides address my third question on the impacts of management on ground nesters and above ground nesters. So here, looking at the ground nesters, we see that most genera, again, are present at both burned and grazed prairies in approximately equivalent amounts. Of the genera that were only observed at 2 or few prairies, most were found in only grazed sites, with Nomata being an outlier there on the far right, being only seen in 1 grazed site. Nomata is I'm going to put a photo there. It's a kleptoparasitic bee. This is just a little bit of life history flavor here. So it's a kleptoparasite, meaning it doesn't build its own nest, but rather lays its eggs in other bees' nests. And in fact, if you catch one of these, I've found it's pretty easy to mistake it for a wasp. It doesn't really have any pollen carrying structures on it, but it is in fact a bee. Now, I have identified fewer above ground nesters. As you can see, a lot fewer genera listed along the bottom. While there may be some interesting trends in the honeybees and Ceratina, they aren't seen equivalently. Again, I think Hylaeus is what stands out here. So we saw a photo of this earlier, but it's found at 6 prairies, putting it squarely in the middle of the pack in terms of distribution, but having only been found at burn sites, that's telling us something, I think. Hylaeus is also, again, just a little bit of life history flavor, also an interesting genus, having lost its external pollen carrying structures. It isn't a kleptoparasite like Nomata, though. It stores pollen internally, which it then provisions to its larvae as kind of this soupy mixture, which the larvae swim in until they're fully grown. So most bees kind of leave a dry block of pollen and nectar that the larvae chomps through, but Hylaeus mix it up with a little pool. So I'm going to wrap up by looking at the bees found in one management or the other together. So looking at them. So we're going to ignore those bees. Now, when I was addressing my questions, I kind of proposed that ground nesting bees should fare better in burned prairies and above ground nesters should fare better in grazed prairies. Now, you may have picked up on this on the last few slides, but my hypothesis does not hold up at all. At least not looking at this subset of bees. Rather, things seem to be inversed, with ground nesters being more diverse in grazed sites and the stem nester Hylaeus present only at burned sites. Of course, Nomata messes this up, but like I said before, it's a bit of a weird bee. There seems to be something interesting going on here, and I'm excited to find out what is going on. And again, it will be interesting to see if this pattern holds up once we're looking at the species level richness data and with the abundance data from our bee bowls. I look forward to filling you in on it all within the coming year.
Great. So as we wrap things up, we just wanted to emphasize again that one of the primary goals of our research is to inform on-the-ground conservation and management by providing information to you, land managers and technicians working in the tallgrass prairie. So although we only have preliminary results today, we will have more results for you in the spring. And on March 13th, we will be presenting a webinar as part of the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative 2018 webinar series. We will have more detailed analyses for many of the questions we raised today about bee and butterfly abundance and richness. We will also have results from the vegetation component of the study, including information on the direct effects of management on insects versus the indirect effects on insects through the vegetation community. We will be working with Jessica Peterson again, hopefully, to host a workshop and a field day in June as well. It's likely that this workshop and field day will be combined and scheduled to follow the native plant community training that many of you may be attending at the end of June. So the field day will include hands-on demonstrations of the methods we used, as well as more detailed information on the life history traits of the bees and butterflies that are important to consider for management. So you heard a little bit about that today, but we'd be getting into more of the details of that once we have our analyses. There's a lot of exciting prairie pollinator research happening at the University of Minnesota currently, and we want to make sure that you have access to that. So in addition to our team, other researchers at the University of Minnesota will be joining us for the field day to share their own exciting prairie pollinator research as well. And we hope you'll be able to join us for one or all of these events next spring. Finally, we'd like to acknowledge all the wonderful people who have made this project possible. A lot of field and lab technicians, many land managers, private landowners. I know some of you listening today have helped us out a lot, so thank you very much. And to LCCMR for the funding again. We are happy to take any questions you have now, or if you think of questions later, please feel free to contact us using the email addresses we put up on the screen. And thank you very much for listening in.
Great, thanks guys. Yeah, if folks have questions, you can feel free to type them into the chat and I'll relay them to Patrick and Julia. That was really nice to hear a little bit about what's happening. Can you guys talk a little bit more about, because there's veg surveys too. So like what's kind of the goal or the future provide for, like what could a manager hope to gain from what you guys are doing?
Specifically in terms of vegetation, are you asking?
No, I guess I'm just saying like zoom out a little bit. Like what in terms of veg and butterflies and bees, what ultimately is your goal to help inform management? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think we're kind of, as more maybe we're pretty conservation biology minded, we're kind of coming at this from, we have this, we skipped through that map that we've all seen a million times, but prairie here in Minnesota is this really restricted. It's seen a large decline in its presence, and it's a pretty special resource that we have here. And by kind of figuring out the connections between management and vegetation and insects and how they directly and indirectly affect each other, maybe we can speak a little bit more about that aspect of the project. We're hoping to kind of have this full mosaic of how to best protect our prairie resources. And yeah, that includes the vegetation, and that includes the pollinators that are important in promoting that vegetation, and also just in and of themselves, in being members of that community.
Yeah, and I guess like specifically, so it's hard for us to give recommendations right now because we're still dealing with a lot of preliminary data and haven't gone through the analysis process for a lot of our data. But I think that things that could be expected to happen, next spring when we give our more complete webinar is, for example, if we find that certain butterfly species they require, say, a suite of grasses to eat as larvae, and those grasses tend to do better under grazing management, for example. And if those are butterflies of concern, or just, in general biodiversity, then that would be, I think, good to know for management, to say these grasses, these resources are important for this suite of butterflies, which I think is something that we don't have right now. Yeah. And again, with bees as well, as Patrick mentioned, the ground nesters and stem nesters, things like that, teasing out, are there effects of management that are affecting a very particular group or a family level or genus level, or because of life history traits, things like that.
Awesome. So there's some questions rolling in. Are you guys done with that?
Yeah.
Okay. There's some questions rolling in. Amanda McColvin was kind of wondering, along the same lines as I was, you said you have yet to analyze the veg data, but can you give us any general observations about the veg structure at the different sites? Or you want to leave that for another day?
I would say we could leave that. I would prefer to leave that for another day. It's Julia and I have been pretty focused on the insects, and we didn't do those vegetation surveys.
Right.
So we don't even have the anecdotal information.
Right.
We do. So you probably noticed at the beginning we have Jen Larson and Diane Larson are both collaborators on this project, and they. I know Diane at least will be speaking to the vegetation data in particular at our webinar in March. And she will be doing a lot of that analysis. So I think it probably is safer not to make assumptions at this point on that, but we definitely have that data, and yes, it is forthcoming, I guess, at this point.
I guess if I could make one anecdotal point, this is something Julia and I have talked about. Of course, because we're focused on the pollinators, it's going to be about flowers, but some of our private grazed sites where cattle are present for kind of longer periods of time, they're there for cattle production, not for conservation grazing necessarily. Those sites sometimes seem to have maybe less floral abundance, and that we're interested to see what impact that has on pollinators, and I can't speak to that directly right now, but it is something we noticed. That's the one thing I can think of.
Yeah. So, and I assume the veg folks were measuring flowering plants instead of just structure and composition?
So the veg surveys were also along transects, and they're based on the I'm trying to remember what it's called, the plot method. So it's basically a frequency,
the nested frequency.
And then we have data on basically what was flowering when we were at sites.
Gotcha.
For our insect surveys, so we don't have the abundance, but we do have kind of a species richness of flowering plants. But yeah, it's very difficult to measure that, and so we won't be able to say as much about that as we would like to later. But we will have the both the vegetation, the diversity, the species richness at our sites, and also an abundance.
Great. So Phil's wondering, were any of the cattle treated with insecticides?
Not that
we
know of, but that is a really interesting. Okay, that's a good question that we can go back and find out though. So we know that a lot of you probably know a lot more about grazing, like the cattle on the ground than we do. So that's
a couple of our sites we suspect had herbicide sprayed mostly for thistle, nodding thistle. But that's all I'm aware of in terms of chemical treatment, but that is something we should follow up with folks on.
Yeah. Okay, so Dave Trav is wondering, with the bee study, not all grazing is the same. Similar questions, Dave. Season long, rotational, spring grazing only. Did you account for these differential grazing treatments?
So that is information that we are collecting. We have that information from our managers. For the fire as well, we try to have some measure of intensity and timing. At this point, we haven't looked at that, but we do have that data and are planning to investigate how those kind of covariates are affecting things.
Yeah, and I think with vegetation, we have a lot more sites. We have 75 sites for vegetation, so it will be easier to incorporate more of those variables into our analyses when we're looking at vegetation. With 20 insect sites, there are only so many variables we can have in our model, so that is something that we do want to get at some of the general differences, and we may not be able to get at all of the specifics with our number of sites for insects, but we will hopefully be able to incorporate some of them. And we do, we do have things like stocking rate and timing. So.
And I think it could help inform future research. Like you might get a flavor for it, and then it could spawn off into something else at a later date.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Robert's wondering, is the wolf site actually the Evanson property? He's been grazing her prairie for several years.
So that is a great question. I'm glad to have it. No, this is actually wolf property. Miss Evanson originally did not agree to work with us for whatever reason, but this is the wolf site. It does border the Evanson site, and that actually has some implications for how we're going to calculate stocking rate. The cattle are allowed to move between sites, But no, this is the wolf property.
Great. So Sarah Vossick's wondering, she says, I know some butterflies have limitations in dispersal distances. Is that true for bees as well?
That is a good question. I believe so. I haven't looked into that specifically recently, but yeah, you know, bumblebees are, if you've ever noticed them whipping through a prairie, they move pretty fast, pretty strong flyers. A lot of those smaller bees are weaker flyers. So I've read some papers though about insects sometimes being almost like plankton, that they can get up into air currents and kind of travel that way. So I'm not ready to rule them out just because they're small bodied. But I think there are differences in dispersal.
Sure.
Yeah, in addition to ground nesting and above ground nesting, I do want to investigate a variety of life history traits. I think ground nesting and stem nesting is the one that makes the most sense to me. I'm kind of building hypotheses around that. But there are some other factors that I think could be really interesting to kind of explore. If like sociality, for example, is associated with one management type or the other, and size, which might kind of be a proxy for distribution.
Lots of questions.
Yeah,
So Lisa's wondering about spraying. Did you look into whether spraying occurred on adjacent sites pertaining to concerns about overspray affecting pollinators on otherwise, you know, apparently protected prairies?
We don't have data on that right now. We did not collect that, but I think that is a really good point, and I know that's something that I believe like Eric Runquist down at the zoo has started to look at for their butterfly surveys. So I think one thing that we do hope to account for in some way is the percentage of agriculture surrounding our sites, or some metric of that, because anecdotally, we have seen them, you know, spraying and kind of felt the effects of drift when we're in the field, and that tends to be, you know, they're not going to spray Glacial Lake State Park next door, but in certain sites that are surrounded by a lot more agriculture, I think that could be a factor. But we don't have data on that right now.
Awesome. Well, I think that seems like people are wrapping up with their questions. A lot of really good questions, though, and I'm sure, yeah, feel free to contact Julia and Patrick if you have additional questions. I'll send out, they created a nice fact sheet that I'll have Mary Beth send out with the next LTT news and links email. So thank you, Julia and Patrick, and we'll all look forward to March to learn more. Next week, we have Nicole Davros to discuss her project involving ringneck pheasant nest site selection and nest survival in diverse prairie reconstructions. And I'll be gone for the next 2 weeks. Mary Beth Block will host the series during my absence. So enjoy, and I'll look forward to listening to the recordings myself. Everything's being recorded, and I'll put it on YouTube this afternoon. So thanks to all that joined today and the awesome participation. So
thank you.
See you in a couple weeks.